As chapter 6 of Daniel begins, it's been nearly 70 years since Daniel and many of the best and brightest young men were taken captives from their homes in Judah to live and serve in this land of Babylon. And during that time and over that time, it probably would have been easy to be molded by this new world filled with idolatry and evil. But in living as a stranger in a strange land, this guy Daniel has consistently remained faithful to God. And we've seen that through the first 5 chapters. He's remained faithful to God alone. And instead of being impacted by this world, Daniel has made an impact as God is seen through him. Now, Daniel, as we begin chapter 6, Daniel's in his 80s. And he faces probably his toughest test yet as he stares down the lion's den. And through this, we not only find a faithful God and what we just, faithful and mighty God as we just sang, but we also learn how there may be lions, and there's even lions in our world today that we may face. We can live for God in our world today. So let's dive into chapter 6. What we're going to do is I'm not going to read through the whole chapter, it's 28 verses. And we're probably familiar with a lot of this story, so we'll just kind of summarize what's going on, and we'll take you to some of the specific scriptures to highlight what's going on so that we can understand what God's trying to teach us through this story. So the year is around 538 BC. It's about a year before Cyrus takes power, and he sends a lot of the Jews, a lot of the captives, back to Jerusalem. But right now, Darius the Mede is in power. Remember, the Medo-Persians defeated the Babylonian Empire. And there's this guy, Darius, who was given the throne under this partnership with Cyrus of Persia. And Darius comes in. He's 62 years old, so he's a little bit of an older guy, more mature, more wise in his years. And the first thing he does is he sets up his government. And it organizes it. And the way he does it is he places 3 presidents under him that will answer to him. And Daniel is one of them. And then under these 3 presidents, he sets 120 satraps, another way of saying they're governors, basically. And they have 120 governors who answer then to these 3 presidents. And so he sets that up. Now, very quickly, Darius realizes something. And look at verse 3. It says, "Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other presidents and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him." Now we know this because in a few times already in Daniel, it's talked about the spirit of the living God was in Daniel. And Darius has noticed something, that this excellent spirit is in him. So the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So what Darius does is he notices Daniel and he says, man, this guy is something. You know what? Out of these presidents, he's my number 1. In fact, I may set him up as second under me, and then the 2 presidents will report to him. So this is how highly favored Daniel has become. And as word trickles down of this possible promotion of Daniel, guess what? These other 2 presidents and some of these governors become jealous. And what they do is they try to find a way that they can knock Daniel down a bit. Knock him down in Darius's eyes, or at the very least that they can find something in Daniel that they can hold over his head so that they can have some control over him. And because Daniel was making them look bad, and they didn't like it. So they began to search out Daniel, and they began to look at him and look at his life. And look at verse 5. They conclude this: "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel." So they can't find anything against him, except this: unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. Now what's happening here is these other people that are jealous of Daniel, they say, you know what, we can't find anything against Daniel that's bad. In fact, the worst thing they can say about Daniel, or the weakest thing that they can say about Daniel, is in regards for his love for God. Basically, he's too devoted to God. Now, wouldn't you want this said? Wouldn't you love to have this said about yourself? I know, I would love for this. You know, the only thing I could say about Mark is he loves God too much. Wow. How cool would that be? And that's what Daniel's noted for. He loves God and he's committed to God so much. And they say, we might be able to exploit this. So here's what they do. But before they do this, so what we have here is we see Daniel, he's living out in his world, but he's living for God in his world. And it's this polytheistic pagan world where it's very hard to do, but Daniel's doing it. And he's keeping faithful to God, and he's still standing for God. And what Daniel begins to face now because of this reveals what we face if we want to live as strangers in a strange land. And that's what we've been talking about in Daniel, right? We want to live as strangers because this is not our home. We live for God in a world that doesn't know him and is opposed to him. So how do we live? Well, we live for him. But when we live for him, we need to know certain things. And here in the story of Daniel, it reveals certain things that if we're going to live as strangers in a strange land, this is what we need to expect, because this is what happens to Daniel. And the first thing we should expect when we live for God in our world today, like Daniel, we should expect our character to be scrutinized. When we live for God in our world, we need to expect that people are going to try to find something that they can knock us down for. Isn't that how it always goes? You see this in our world today. When somebody is right and they're doing things right, people try to hit them that much more because they want to knock somebody else down. Well, Daniel's character, it stands out. In fact, it's noticed in a positive way by Darius, but it's also noticed, seen as a negative by those who were jealous of him. Daniel was basically, he was known as a man who did the right things the right way for the right reasons. And Daniel not only served his God well, even though he's basically alone in his faith in this land, he also did his job well. He lived as a good citizen and a good employee. You know, Paul kind of touches on this in Colossians when he talks about, and he's talking about our character and how we should live in our world. And he says, whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive inheritance as your reward. You're serving the Lord Christ. So he's saying, basically, you know what? We need to have good character. Now, if we look at this word character basically what it means is it's about what we do when nobody's looking and there's nothing for us to lose or gain is kind of how we define character. It's how we are when we're not trying to impress anybody. We're just living because this is the way we think and we should live. And character isn't about perfection. Notice here they call Daniel blameless. They say there's nothing that they can hold against him or count against him. It doesn't mean that Daniel does everything perfect. He's a man. Daniel sins. Let's not put him up so high on a pedestal. But what they're saying is he's faithful and he's consistent. He's a man who could be trusted to do things right. Man, what a great thing to be said about a person, isn't it? That should be what we seek to be said about us because it's important for us. Because you know why? Our world, just like our kids, if you have kids, do you know what? They watch us a lot more than we think. When we're at work, our coworkers are watching us. When we're in relationships, we're being watched. You see, our character is always being examined by our world. Does our character stand out? Does it stand out at work? Or through your relationships or through your choices you make? Well, these other presidents and the satraps, they note Daniel's character, right? And they say, man, that stands out. We need to do something about it. And you see, much like our world today, this is how people get ahead. Rather than saying, wow, somebody's doing right, maybe we should seek to be like them, what does our world want to do? Let's try to bring them down so we look a little better. Right? Because it's a lot easier to knock somebody down than to change your life and the way you live, right? So they're saying, let's knock them down a bit rather than lifting ourselves up. And what's probably happening here is it's kind of much like people in our government today. They're in it for themselves. they have a good gig. Maybe they're skimming off the top. They're finding a way to get wealthy out of this, and they can cut some corners and get ahead. Yet Daniel is making them look really bad, and he's threatening what they're going to try to do. It's kind of like when you're in school. Do you ever have school and you had a big test coming up and like nobody really studies or takes it serious, and everybody's like, oh man, and you take the test and you're just like, man, we really blew it. But we all blew it, so there's going to be a curve. And then there's always that one person, you know that person, right? Who somehow gets 100 on the test, and the teacher stands before you. Well, you all did horrible, and I would love to curve this. And everybody's like, yes, but somebody did what they were supposed to do. So you face your own consequences. And I think this is kind of how they're viewing Daniel. He's the curve buster. We gotta get him, right? We gotta knock him down. So they devise a plan to get Daniel out. And this teaches us something else. Not only when we live as strangers in a strange land, we should expect our character to be scrutinized, but we should also, like Daniel, expect our world to stand against us. When we seek to live for God in our world, we should expect opposition. We should expect people to be out to knock us down. And these men, if they couldn't trap or expose Daniel in doing wrong, maybe they could use his devotion to God against him. So what they do is they devise a truly diabolical scheme here. I mean, this shows real evil genius, I guess is a good way of saying it. And they come before Darius. And here's what they say in verse 6. They come before Darius and they say, oh, king, live forever. In verse 6, and then they say, all the presidents of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the counselors, the governors, are agreed that the king should establish a new law. Now here we already know that they're lying because they never brought Daniel into this. They're doing this behind Daniel's back, yet he's one of these presidents. So they're already lying to the king, but the king doesn't necessarily know because they probably all didn't come in to see him. So they say, oh, we're all agreed in this, and this is a great idea. You should make a law, and here's what the law is, and it should be binding, or it should be enforceable, that whoever makes a petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, Darius hears this, and somebody goes, we want you to be honored for 30 days. Let's put all the attention on you, Darius. You should be there. You're great. And we know how great you are, but not everybody does. And it's early on in his reign, right? There's this empire change, this big regime change. So they're probably painting it like, so if people just focused on you and saw how great you were, then, man, they'd be even more committed to you, kind of like we are. And Darius is like, yeah, that's a good thing, right? So Darius doesn't really think about this. It's kind of appeals to his pride and his ego a little bit. And he says, yeah, this sounds like a great thing. And, that he could have the sole authority. Now, they're not saying, Darius, you're going to be a god. They're not telling him that. Remember, it says, don't make a petition to any god or man. So they're just saying, man, we want you to be the man. So let's have everybody else pause everything else that they're putting focus on and just focus on you. And Darius says, this sounds like a good idea. Boy, these guys are sneaky, aren't they? It's bad. Now, if anybody broke this law over these 30 days, they would face execution. And you saw here that they would be cast into the den of lions. During the Persian Empire, this was their main way of execution, is they would feed people to lions. And they'd throw them in this pit with lions. And see, what these guys knew is they knew Daniel prayed. They knew about Daniel. They had served with him before. So they kind of knew that Daniel prayed to his God. And so they were hoping that by making this law, they could catch Daniel in this, breaking the law. And sure enough, they get the king to sign this into law. And because it seemed good on the surface. Now, an interesting thing about the laws of Persia. Persia ran different than the Babylonian Empire. Persia was more of a constitutional form of government. Nebuchadnezzar, he was the king, right? Who he wanted to kill, he killed. Who he wanted to keep alive, he kept alive. He was the law. in the Medo-Persian Empire, the king was still looked at as the man, so much so that if he made a law, not even he could undo it, because then he would be like saying, oh, I made a mistake. And the king can't make a mistake. So once he signs that into law, he can't even change it. That's why this is a big deal. So he signs this into law. And it starts to go forward, right? You know, our commitment and service to God out in our world will always offend those who do not serve God and aren't committed to Him. Do you know that? We're always going to offend, and it's always going to be in opposition. You see, because we recognize one higher than ourselves, the one who makes the rules, one who we submit to. See, if our world, if those around us admit this, right, and they say that's okay, then they eventually will say, well, then if there's a God, then I also have to live my life accordingly. That's why people are in such a tizzy trying to take God away from everything, because they don't want to be reminded of that, and it frees them to do what they want. And that's basically how they're thinking here as well, and it's what we face in our world today. In fact, Paul talks to Timothy about this, and he says, indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Deal with it. This is the cost of following God. When we live for God with godly character, even when we don't try to make a big deal about it, it's going to be noticed by our world. And just like Daniel's world did, our world will oppose us. So anyway, back to the story. It's now law. This is the new law of the land. What is Daniel going to do? If he remains faithful to God, then he breaks the law of the land. But if he obeys the law of the land, he's unfaithful to God. And Daniel now finds himself where we may find ourselves when we choose to live for God in our world. And it's a place where our loyalties are tested. Have you ever been there? When we choose to follow God and live for Him, our loyalties will always be tested because we live in a fallen world. And there's a choice to be made in how we live. Now, Daniel sees his law. He could have compromised, right? I mean, it's 30 days. It's not like it's a new law that you could never do this. And sometimes we look at this and we say, well, maybe we take a break from praying for 30 days. I mean, God understands. We're not, we don't have to pray every day and God's going to smash us if we don't. Well, here God led Daniel to this, so it is for him. Right? But we may say, we could take a break. Or maybe Daniel could have said, maybe I'll just pray in secret. Like a secret saint. Did you ever have that? Maybe I'll go to work and I won't tell anybody I'm a Christian. I don't want anybody to know. And Daniel could have done that, and he could have tried to hide what he was doing. When it comes to standing with God in the midst of a world that does not, there's always going to be a choice to be made, and we can't hide forever. Do we stand with God, or do we yield to our world? This much like the choice Joshua gave to the people when they're getting ready to cross over in the Jordan River into the promised land. Do you remember that? And Joshua gives them a big speech, and he says, you know what? You need to decide this day who you're going to serve. You could serve the gods of these other nations, or you could serve the one true God. And at the end, he goes, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And we're all going to be brought to that decision if we choose to live for God in our world. And it's a question of loyalty. Now, we should be loyal to the laws of the land. God tells us that. Paul tells us that in Romans, that he puts governments up and we're to submit to those governments. So we should be loyal to the laws and the rules of the land as part of our loyalty to God. So as we're loyal to God, we should obey laws. Nowhere does it say we shouldn't, except when those laws or rules go against God, we must stand with God. Do you know that? We must. And this is what Daniel does. Look at verse 10. It says, now, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed. So he knows that this goes into law, and he does this anyway. He went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day, and he prayed and gave thanks before his God. I want you to picture this. Daniel knows the consequences. He knows what's going to happen. Now, in Daniel's house, and oftentimes in this region, because it was so hot, they would have a little hut on top of their roof. And in that hut, it was all windows on every side so the breeze could come in. And this is where Daniel prayed every day. In fact, he prayed 3 times a day. And it says he would face Jerusalem. Now, why he's facing Jerusalem is because he's remembering where he came from and where God has promised them that they would be. So he gets on his knees in humility, and then he recognizes God's will and his promise in facing Jerusalem, and he prays. Now, I want you to notice something. Daniel didn't make a big show of this, right? Daniel doesn't go into the public square and said, "This law is ungodly, and I will come and I will pray in front of you all." He's not making some big rebellious act out of this, right? He doesn't make sure that everybody sees him do this. But he also doesn't try to hide. Instead, he goes, again, to where he usually does. And I want you to look at the end of verse 10 again. It says, he gave thanks to God as he had done previously. Nothing changes for Daniel. Daniel always prayed, and he says, I'm going to continue to pray. Isn't this interesting? Sometimes we would rather react. We hear things that happen in our government and laws that get passed, and they're ungodly laws, and all of a sudden we raise up against it. We got to stand against this. Well, where were you standing up for God's way before they passed this law? See, sometimes we just like to react, and we like to rebel, and we like to riot or peaceful protest things, right? And we get in all this, and we virtue signal people, and we say, this is the way. Daniel doesn't do any of that. He just says, you know what? I've always prayed to God. This is my commitment to him. This is my life. This isn't just something I do. It's my life. I'm going to continue. And he continues as he had previously done. And even though Daniel doesn't try to hide it, and he doesn't try to flaunt it, he had to know the inevitable was going to happen. Eventually, he's going to get caught. And sure enough, these other leaders suspect Daniel's going to do this, so they're watching him. Imagine they got little binoculars out looking up at his little hut, and they see him. And they're like, got him! They're excited, right? In fact, they go right to the king, and they say, King Darius, remember this law you signed, and for 30 days it seems like it's going pretty well. Except, do you remember if somebody breaks that law, they get thrown in the den of the lions, and you can't even change that? And Darius is like, yeah, I know, I signed the law, I read it. And they go, well, we found somebody that broke the law. And he goes, really? Okay. And then they go, remember, you can't change this. And he goes, no. He goes, well, bring the person to me, and we'll execute judgment. And they said, oh, we forgot to tell you. And here's the way they say it. That slave from Judah, Daniel. See, they're really out to get him, right? And they go, that Israelite guy. He's not even one of us. Yeah, he's against you. He did this. And he therefore must be thrown in the lion's den. And it's at this point Darius knew he messed up big. He got played. You see, he didn't think through this whole thing, and these guys played him like a fiddle. And Darius' heart sinks, and he's like, Daniel? And he starts to think, I would have never made this law if I knew it was going to hurt Daniel, right? So he starts getting angry at himself, and he starts beating himself up, and he spends the rest of that day trying to figure a loophole. How can we get out of this? How can we kind of say, well, the law is for the people, but Daniel's above the people because he's one of the presidents, so he doesn't really have to do this. Maybe we can do it this way, and we can do it this way. And his presidents come to him and say, we know you're trying to get out of this. You can't. Remember our law. Even if the king makes a law, it can't be changed. And Darius knows that's what needs to happen. And Daniel's fate is sealed, and he says, bring Daniel to me. Now, Daniel knew that by him praying, it could cost him. This is the cost of his loyalty to God, right? Yet Daniel does it anyway. And it's something that we too must weigh in everything we do. Because there's a cost in following Jesus. In fact, Jesus talks about, we take up our cross and follow him, right? And it may cost us. And you see, when we seek to live for God as strangers in a strange land, you know what we should also expect? We should expect our faith to be stretched. And here's what happens to Daniel. He knows it's going to cost him, but he does it anyway. Why? Because he trusts God. And he says, God's call for me is even more. The more we seek to live for God, the stronger our faith needs to be. And this wasn't Daniel's first great leap of faith, was it? Remember, 70 years prior to this, he takes a great stand in not wanting to eat the king's defiled food. And that was a big step of faith. It wasn't as big as this, but it was a step of faith. In fact, consistently as he's telling dreams and the interpretation of dreams, and often it's a judgment that he has to deliver. But in faith, Daniel does it boldly because God called him to do this. And he takes these great steps of faith. And his faith is beginning to stretch and to grow. And this is how our faith grows. Do you know that? Our faith just doesn't appear out of thin air, or it doesn't just come out when it's needed, to stand for the big stuff. If we're waiting just to stand with the big stuff with our faith, but not having it anywhere else, trusting ourselves, we're not going to have it for the big stuff. Because faith has to grow. It has to be stretched. God has to work us and work in us in this way. You see, it grows by getting stretched beyond the comfortable and the capable. That's how faith is stretched. To where we're not comfortable with something and we say, I can't do this, but I'm going to trust. And Daniel places his trust firmly in God and God alone. And this is where our faith grows. And it's where our faith grows most. Do you know when our faith grows most? When we have nothing else to trust in but God. Sometimes when God takes everything else away from us and all our other resources, that's his grace. Because he's saying, now your faith is really going to grow because you're not going to be tempted to trust anything else except God and God alone. In fact, this is why James notes in chapter 1 that we're to count these times where our faith is stretched and we're tested, our loyalties are tested. We're to count those moments as all joy when we meet these trials, right? You know that the testing or the stretching of your faith produces steadfastness, consistency, character for God. And we're to let steadfastness have its full effect so that we may be perfect, complete, lacking nothing. It's in this tension where most people would say we should be most afraid, but it's in this tension when we're most secure because we're right where God is working. And that's a great place to be. In fact, as Daniel is brought to the king, even Darius knows that Daniel's only hope is his God. Now, this isn't Daniel saying, Darius saying, I believe in Daniel's God and I trust him alone. This isn't any of this, but he sees Daniel and he says, the only hope you have is in your God. And I know you've served him consistently, so let's hope he saves you. In fact, look at verse 16. He says, the king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. And Darius is like, I really hope this. Hope beyond hope. Does our faith stretch beyond the comfortable or the safe in living for God? Does your faith stretch beyond the comfortable or capable? This is what we're called to do when we live for God. It's easy to have faith when all's going well and we're risking little, but our faith will soar when we cling to God no matter the cost. And this is what Daniel does. So Daniel's fate seems sealed, right? As he's then thrown into the den of lions. Now I want you to picture this lion's den. And they've been able to bring up some archaeology in that area to understand what these dens were like. They're basically a cave, and it's got 2 rooms that can be separated so that they could put the lions in one room while a guy would clean out the one room, and then they would let the lions back out. And there's many lions in this den, in this huge cave or cavern. And then above it was a hole. And that's where they would throw the food down into the lions. And it's also, when someone was executed, they'd throw them down into this pit, this den. It's probably about 12 to 15-foot drop. So that's what we're picturing here with Daniel. And Daniel is then dropped through this hole in the top. And then immediately, the presidents and Darius, they put a stone over the top of it, and they seal it with their signet rings. They're saying, this is so nobody does any funny business, so we're going to make sure this is sealed. Kind of gives us a picture of Jesus in the tomb, doesn't it? But anyway, they seal this up, right? And then the leaders then leave, and they're like reveling in their treachery. Yes, we did it. Aren't we great? While Darius is crushed. In fact, it says that Darius goes back to the palace, and he spends a sleepless night. He says, I don't want any musicians trying to cheer me up. Don't bring me any food or drink or anything. I'm just going to curl up, and I'm going to feel bad about myself, and I'm going to mourn the loss of Daniel. And he couldn't even sleep the whole night. Now, in contrast to this, although the king's night was sleepless, what he didn't know is that God came and shut the mouths of the lions, and Daniel probably had a great night's sleep. In fact, he probably had a lion for a pillow as Daniel's in this den. And he's being kept safe. Now, some people, there's something miraculous going on here, and people always want to break down the miraculous. In fact, there's liberal theologians that look to this and say, this is how this could have happened, because they don't want to ever admit that God has power. They say, here's what probably happened. The lions weren't hungry. So when Daniel goes down there, they just were like, I'm not hungry right now. So we know where he is. We'll go get him when we get hungry. And they say, so that's why Daniel didn't get eaten. Come on. In fact, as we'll see in just a few verses, that's not the case. Others say, well, Daniel was thrown down in this pit, but then he got up before the lions could get him, and he hid in a crevice in the rocks all night, so they couldn't get to him. So picture this. 80-something-year-old man is dropped from a height of about 15 feet onto hard stone, and he just leaps to his feet and he goes, running around while lions are chasing him, and he sits out and hides in a crevice all night. Come on. It's not possible, right? You see, the impossible happens, and God does the miraculous. We don't always have to run around that trying to explain everything. Sometimes when the Bible says something, it says it because it's true, and God does the miraculous here. Anyway, so the king's sleepless all night, and at the crack of dawn, as the sun just starts to come up, it says, the king races to the lion's den to kind of mourn what happened to Daniel. And he comes to it and he removes the stone and he kind of laments. He shouts and lament out into this pit, right? It's probably too dark for him even to see what happened down there. But he kind of laments. And he says, may your God, Daniel, have saved you. Please come out. So he's like, oh man, I wish that God could have saved you. And then you could come out, Daniel. And as he's saying this, I kind of picture a pause, because I like a great movie, and that kind of dramatic pause. But I picture a dramatic pause. Maybe Daniel was just maybe he woke Daniel up, so Daniel's kind of stretched. And the king's just like, ah. And then all of a sudden he hears, "Oh, king, live forever. It's me, Daniel." Imagine this shock. And he shouts out, verse 20, 21 and 22, "Oh, king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the mouths of the lion. They haven't harmed me because I was found blameless before him and also before you, O king. I have done no harm." So Daniel says, hey, king, I serve my God and my God is faithful. Not only that, I want you to know I'm faithful to my God, but I'm also faithful to you. And what he's saying to Darius is, I know this law was made up. I know you didn't really mean this law when you wrote it. So know this, I'm still always faithful to you as my king in my loyalty to God. And the king knows this. So he brings Daniel out, and Daniel as well. And then the king looks around and he says, where are these guys who did this? These treacherous scoundrels, right? And he takes these men who did this, and we're not told how many of them there are. Could be 122 of them. I doubt it. There's probably just a kind of this... the few that kind of led this. But he takes them and their families. Now, this isn't a godly decree or a godly principle that we punish you and your family. In fact, God says the son should never be punished for the sins of the father. But here, this is the Persian Empire. This is telling what happened. May not be right, but this is what happened. So he takes these men, but he also takes their whole family, and he throws them into the lion's den together. And you know what it says? Before their bodies even hit the ground, the lions tear them apart. But I thought the lions weren't hungry. Suddenly they got hungry, right? Again, that's the miraculous, right? And they ripped the people to shred before they hit the ground. And so this is the story. And we see then the result of Daniel's stand, his faith and commitment to God, as Darius then proclaims to Daniel, and he makes a proclamation throughout the land. Look at verse 26. He says, I make a decree, or a new law, that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God. Oh, man. Unlike the dead gods that we worship. Enduring forever, his kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall never be to an end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So he says, everybody needs to recognize God. Now, he's not trying to legislate morality. He's not saying you're only to worship this God. He says, I make a decree. Everybody has to notice this at least. I want this to be known to everyone, that this is the living God who endures forever, whose dominion will never end. So basically, here we have yet another king in this, over the 70 years, declares the goodness and greatness of God and the glory of God. You see, this is why we should live for God in our world and why Daniel stood for God even here. It wasn't so God would reward him by keeping him safe. That's not why Daniel obeyed God, because Daniel says, well, if I get thrown in the lions, God will rescue me from the lions. He doesn't know that, right? So that's not the reason. Now, in Hebrews chapter 11, God's Hall of Fame, right? The Faith Hall of Fame, it says, by faith, all these things happen. In verse 33, it says, by faith, some even stopped the mouths of lions. Now, the writer of Hebrews is obviously looking to this and says, by faith, the lions' mouths were stopped by Daniel's faith. And he said, yeah, see, when we have faith, nothing can ever touch us. But then just a few verses later in verse 36, you can write this down. It says, but others were stoned. They were sawed in two. They were killed with the sword. We have people like Paul, who was beheaded, right? Even though he was so faithful to God to the end. Being faithful to God doesn't guarantee us protection or that we never get sick or we never suffer or we never go through bad things. That's not the purpose of being faithful to God. Daniel stood for God because God is worthy. And like Daniel, when we live for God, we should expect this. Not protection, not that we'll be saved, but that our God will be glorified. This is why we want to live for him, so that everybody can see our God. In fact, that's the attitude Paul had, isn't it? He's writing it from prison and facing a possible death sentence, and he's writing to Philippians. We just went through this, right? And he says this, as it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not at all be ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. No matter what happens to me, here's my goal, that Christ should be honored. God should be glorified. We're to be faithful to God, not so that God will be faithful to us, but rather we're to be faithful to God because God is always faithful. And when we're faithful to him, then he's seen through us. You see, when we live for God, no matter the cost, it speaks beyond just ourselves. It shines light on the greatness and the worth of our God to a world around us that desperately needs him. This is what Daniel teaches us through this. This is the great reward for living as a stranger in a strange land. Chapter 6 kind of ends this narrative part. And next week we're going to start into some really cool prophecies and visions God gave Daniel during these 70 years. But this kind of sums this whole thing up of living as a stranger in a strange land. Here's what it's done. Here's what's going to happen to us when we do it. But here's the result. God will be glorified. Despite having our character scrutinized, our others opposing us, and our loyalties tested, and our faith stretched, through our commitment to our God, who is worth living for, he will be glorified, and others will always take notice. You see, as we look at the story of Daniel and the lions, then we know this. When we live for God as strangers in a strange land, things can get pretty wild. And they will. But God will be glorified. Though there be lions, when we live for God in our world, we present our God who alone is faithful. Isn't that awesome? Isn't that cool? It's so much more than just a little Sunday school story about some lions, but it's about God's faithfulness and what happens when we live for him, so that we can live for him today. So let's pray.